Hi, everybody, and welcome to Andy Warhol, Art, Commerce, and Revolution. We're so excited that you could join us today, and we're very happy to be partnering with the Andy Warhol Museum. My name is Bridget. I work with the ADC Annual Awards team here at the One Club for Creativity. And this is a huge year for ADC as we're celebrating our 100th birthday. So in addition to the award show, which is now open for entries over at adcawards.org. We're celebrating by taking a look back at all of the incredible artists, designers, and art directors who built the Art Directors Club. So one component of this is a historical timeline. So this is online, where you can see all of these people and artworks featured. So here you'll see people like Norman Rockwell, Milton Glaser, Paul Rand, Ruth Ansel, Sippy Pinellas, and many, many others. So I'm going to link to the ADC historical timeline here in the chat. There it is. And then also there you can download all of the annual exhibition books for free. So those date all the way back to 1921. And so today we're turning the spotlight over to Andy Warhol, who won his first ADC medal back in the 1950s, and who is also a part of the ADC Hall of Fame. So a few quick items before we get started. Grace will be taking questions at the end. So as you think of them, please add them to the Q&A box. And then when you're chatting, don't forget to change to all panelists and attendees so everyone can see it. And so now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker. She is a gallery educator at the Andy Warhol Museum, and she's worked at the museum for over 9 years. And so it's my pleasure to introduce Grace Marston.
Hello, greetings from Pittsburgh. Thanks again, everyone, for coming. It's a pleasure to be here today and be a part of the ADC 100th anniversary. So for my presentation, I'm going to be featuring some images from the Andy Warhol Museum collection, as well as some images from the Art Directors Club annuals, which were very helpfully compiled for me by the ADC staff. And we'll kind of see where those two connections overlap, and I can provide all the insight and fun facts I've got about the illustrations that Warhol did at this time. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up my PowerPoint. Here we go. All right, so hopefully you all can see that. So first of all, you should know that it would be quite impossible to cover Andy Warhol's entire commercial art career in less than an hour. Andy Warhol first moved to New York City in 1949, and he didn't become a famous pop art painter until 1962. So his first 13 years in New York, he was just working primarily as a commercial illustrator and doing a few fine art projects here and there on the side. So it did all start in 1949 after Andy Warhol had graduated from art school at Carnegie Tech, now the Carnegie Mellon University, and he moved to New York the summer after he graduated. And he already had some kind of connections in the city. He had some other classmates from Carnegie Tech that had already found some commercial art jobs here and there in New York. So he was able to use those contacts to get some of his first jobs. And so he was notoriously hired by Glamour magazine, and one of his first jobs in New York was to illustrate an article for Glamour called "What is Success?", where Warhol was drawing these very practical loafers and shoes climbing up the ladder of success. And there were a few different definitions in this article for what success is, but quite fittingly, the main title was "Success is a Job in New York." And so Andy Warhol did achieve success as a commercial illustrator in New York City quite quickly. The first art project he did that was recognized by the Art Directors Club was actually for this radio program by CBS called The Nation's Nightmare. And it was a 6-part true crime documentary, mostly about drug trafficking and drug addiction. And then 2 different parts of that 6-part series were later released on like a vinyl box set LP. So that's what you're looking at here. You're looking at the illustration Warhol did to illustrate the Crimes on the Waterfront story. And then in our collection at the museum, we have some of the preliminary drawings that Warhol used to illustrate the Nation's Nightmare True Crime series. What's interesting is that Warhol actually got this job by winning a contest. So rather than reach out to CBS directly to apply for the job, Lou Dorsman, the CBS director of design, had actually organized a contest to illustrate the Nation's Nightmare ads. And Warhol won, partially because Lou Dorsman, the CBS director, thought that Warhol's illustrations looked a lot like Ben Shahn, and he's not the only person to say that. A lot of other art directors over the years said that they hired Warhol because he drew like Ben Shahn, but he was a much cheaper, more affordable commercial artist to work with. And so the actual illustration that won an Art Directors Club award was this one right here, which was used both on the album cover packaging for the Nation's Nightmare album, and it was used in newspaper advertisements. So it had first appeared in a September 1951 issue of the New York Times. And so it was awarded as like a radio ad, as a newspaper ad rather than for the album cover itself. And interestingly, Warhol actually used a man holding a gun as the source material rather than a man holding a needle, and he changed the gun into a needle for this illustration. And so we do not have every single ADC award that Warhol received in the museum collection, but we do at least have this first one that he got in 1952. And Warhol also saved the program for the Art Directors Club Awards luncheon. And so I learned from this little pamphlet that they served Key West turtle soup, prime rib with beignet potatoes and sauteed string beans, and frozen souffle Alaska for dessert at this Art Directors Club luncheon. And so Warhol is listed, he's one of the many names that you can see in this booklet here. And so Warhol continued to work for CBS throughout the early 50s as they transitioned into more and more television programming. And so he would do the title cards for like the backdrops of news reports. And so you can see here that he was actually featured in Art Director and Studio News magazine for a little article they were doing about how they're kind of bragging about how they're using top artists to illustrate their title cards. And then along with doing a lot of work for CBS, Warhol also worked for their direct competitor, NBC, throughout the early 50s. So Warhol was always a freelance illustrator, so there was really nothing holding him back from doing an ad for one company and doing an ad for their direct competitor at the exact same time. So these are two images pulled from the Art Directors Club annuals that Warhol did for NBC. His main project for NBC was actually illustrating these promotional booklets that would illustrate the radio programs that NBC was doing to advertisers. So the idea was that the advertisers would read these little blurbs and look at these illustrations and decide, like, I want to buy ad space for that particular radio show. And so once again, the Warhol Museum has a few of the preliminary drawings that Warhol used for these NBC title cards. And then also Voices and Events, which you can see was like a news radio program for NBC, was at some point, NBC was thinking about making Voices and Events into a little EP released on vinyl. And so here in the museum collection, we've got like a mock-up proof for that potential album, but the album never got made. And so when the museum first started exhibiting this object, it created quite a stir in the community of Warhol record cover collectors, because all these collectors, you know, they're very, very studious about their work and, you know, about finding out about every album that exists. And nobody knew, you know, that this album was ever considered for production. And so a lot of collectors were like, wait, where can I buy Voices and Events? And unfortunately, you can't. But now it's time to talk about I. Miller shoes. So the bulk of the Warhol images that are featured in the Art Directors Club annuals are the illustrations that he did for I. Miller shoes. He was their main client in the mid-1950s. You know, really, it was kind of his bread and butter, was doing these shoe illustrations. And it's something that he really made a name for himself in the fashion industry as a shoe illustrator, to the point that Women's Wear Daily called him the Leonardo of the shoe trade at one point. So that illustration that I just showed you was the first illustration that the ADC recognized as part of Warhol's I. Miller project. So he got an award for distinctive merit for this particular illustration here. But yeah, there are tons of I. Miller ads in the ADC collection, and of course in the museum collection as well. So it's interesting, you can kind of see like the quality of images where, like, the Warhol images are a little bit higher resolution, but they're directly from the newspapers themselves. So you can see that they're all brown and yellowed from age, and that there's some wear and tear in the corners and the seams and things like that. But anyway, Warhol started working for I. Miller Shoes in 1955, and he was their sole illustrator until 1957. He continued to work for them after 57, but at that point, the company actually went under new ownership, and so they started to hire a couple other people as well. But it was an old and successful business. It originally founded in 1901, but the brand had become a little bit, over the hill, a little bit passe and old hat. And so they really wanted to start this ambitious rebrand to become another top name in fashion. And so this campaign was also innovative in that prior to 1955, I. Miller's 14 different stores across the country all did their own individual advertising campaigns. So this was the first actually like centralized coordinated campaign for the company. And also previously, I. Miller would buy little bits of ad space in all sorts of different magazines and publications, and they kind of like cast a wide net in terms of their advertising. But for this campaign, they actually focused their purchases to buy more space in bigger publications. So they were only buying space in the top fashion magazines of the day, as well as the Sunday New York Times, rather than having lots of little ads in lots of little places. And so this was all coordinated by Geraldine Stutz, who became the vice president of I. Miller, but she was already familiar with Warhol because she had worked for Glamour magazine in the early 50s at the time that Warhol was working there. And so she has this great quote where she says, "Andy and I began a campaign which was unprecedented at the time. We ran full page ads, half pages every Sunday in the New York Times. And it was a spectacular showcase for I. Miller and for Andy as well. It expanded his audience in a way that no magazine editorial ever could have. In a sea of tiny little images that were the pages of the Times, these bold blockbuster fantasies were extraordinarily effective. What the ads did was to revitalize and revive the I. Miller brand. From a dowdy, musty, fusty, dusty, dowager establishment, it became a stylish emporium for debutantes." And so what you'll make notice about a lot of these ads is Warhol, he had the capability of rendering these shoes in detail. So these are some drawings that we've got in the museum collection where you can see different styles and different, methods of shoe construction. But for the most part, Warhol's actual ads, show the shoes quite simply. And some of the ads aren't for shoes at all. So the Art Directors Club recognized several I. Miller ads that were about other accessories sold by the company. So Warhol won an award of distinctive merit for this hat illustration, and then you see gloves and wallets and things like that. But in a lot of very minimal illustrations that don't necessarily show the details of the products themselves, but he's still kind of like showing the style of and personality of the brand without emphasizing the details of the individual products. And then that goes along with the shoe ads as well. So in these shoe ads, you can see a little bit of variation within the shoes, but the shoes aren't taking up as much space as the legs, so a lot of these ads just feature impossibly slender women's legs, and you can't see their faces, you can't see what they're wearing, but you can still kind of tell that she's stylish just from the way that Warhol drew her. And this is another ad that was recognized by the ADC, which is extremely minimal. So you can barely see any part of the shoe. All you can see is the laces and the tip of the toe. And here at the museum, we have both the newspaper clipping itself from where the ad appeared in the Times, as well as a large format negative. So that's actually like one of the tools that you use in reproducing the illustration over and over. So it's sort of like an art making tool that we've got in the collection here, which is cool. But again, you can see that Warhol was quite capable of rendering the details of an individual shoe quite beautifully. And so there are a few exceptions to the rule where Warhol is kind of presenting the product accurately, as you might expect in a fashion advertisement. But for the most part, it was a lot more conceptual. One thing that is important to note about these I. Miller ads is that there are several instances of Warhol employing repetition, but variation within that repetition, which of course became a major motif of his pop art career in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So in this ad on the left, you see 32 different shoes, which, do look kind of similar at a glance, but then eventually you see all the little details and variation within that set. And to me, that jumped out because Warhol most famously did 32 paintings of soup cans, which all look the same at a glance. But then you see that there are 32 different flavors of soup. And so that's where the variation comes in. And also at the Museum of Modern Art, those 32 soup cans are usually displayed in 4 rows of 8, as you can see in this shoe ad right here. And then we've also got this drawing of a bunch of paint cans, which I also thought recalled Warhol's Campbell Soup can series in an interesting prescient way. And so once again, you see that repetition but variation within all the different cans. And bizarrely, this ad was meant to convey the idea of no color, even though it's a bunch of different paint cans, but it was advertising a bunch of shoes in neutral color tones. And so that's sort of the idea that this ad is supposed to convey. And that was an interesting theme I noticed in a lot of these black and white I. Miller newspaper ads is, it's limited, it's black and white, but you're still supposed to convey the idea of color when I. Miller is making new shoes in all different sorts of colors. And so in this case, we see an ad for some stem green shoes that Warhol illustrated by drawing the shoes walking through some fresh, tall grass. And then for a lemon yellow shoes, Warhol filled the ad with these 2 huge lemons, and then you just see kind of a few shoes cast aside at the bottom, but the lemon is the focus of the ad itself. And then finally, this ad is meant to convey all the colors. And so once again, he's limited in the black and white medium. So what he did to convey all the colors was draw what looks like the inside of a kaleidoscope. So that's what this kind of geometric thing on the top is supposed to be. And this is one of the most kind of abstract and symbolic ads that Warhol did for I. Miller shoes. So I. Miller, they were selling their shoes at Henry Bendel, very, very famous accessory store. And so rather than draw any products, any shoes or accessories at all, Warhol simply drew the black and white stripes, which were emblematic of Bendel's. But of course, Bendel stripes are very clean and smooth, and that's not the way Warhol drew them. Warhol had rough edges for all of the stripes in this advertisement. And so it's like a reference to Bendel's without actually, incorporating the original Bendel stripes. So a very kind of conceptual minimalist ad here, but you can see, just based on like the other newspaper bits at the edges, how much space this ad, took up on the newspaper page. And so even though it's not showing any products, it's still definitely catching the attention of the viewer because they bought so much ad space just to show these stripes. And then some of the ads aren't really for a product or a store at all. It's just the brand wishing a happy holidays to their consumers. And so these are 2 different Easter ads. The one on the right is in the Art Directors Club annuals. The one on the left is in the museum collection. And yeah, it's just I. Miller wishing a happy Easter to all of their customers rather than trying to advertise any of their new shoes that they put out, or hats probably as well for Easter celebrations. And so Andy Warhol's I. Miller ads really did get him a lot of recognition. This is, almost a decade before he became recognized as a fine art pop artist, but he was really, really making a name for himself in the advertising world to the point that Printers Ink magazine did this whole little profile on the I. Miller ad campaign. And you can see, in the little like subtitle that it says, "Instead of merchandise, the ads flash just a hint of high fashion." And so Peter Palazzo, their art director, explained that, like, we try to stir the woman's imagination to make her think of shoes without giving her the details. And, that's exactly what these ads did, right? They didn't show the details of the shoe designs, but they sold the sizzle and not the steak, as they say in the advertising world. And in a lot of these examples featured in the magazine, you can still see that repetition with variation, right? And all the different heels of the shoes and that ad in the center top and the tips of the shoes on the side, that same kind of motif that he became famous for in his pop art. And he was even featured in these mail order instructional art courses. So this was put out by the Artist Institute of America. They would put out these booklets that you could order through the mail, and they advertised that they were lessons prepared by the nation's top professional artists. But really what it looks like the organization did is they just compiled a bunch of different, stunning examples of graphic designs and then made it into a booklet that you could kind of copy or take inspiration from and learn how to do commercial art that way. And then Warhol continued to do a lot of shoe illustrations in his fine art side projects alongside like his I. Miller work. So this is an ad for the opening of Warhol's Shoe in America art exhibit, which took place at the Bodley Gallery in December of 1956. So what Warhol did is a series of drawings of shoes that he rendered with gold leaf, so they're very kind of shiny and glamorous, and they're illustrating kind of the persona of a bunch of different celebrities at the time. And so it was actually a really successful exhibition at the Bodley Gallery, more so than most of Warhol's fine art shows at the time, because Warhol really experienced a lot of rejection from the fine art world during this period. He did do a few gallery shows here and there throughout the 50s, but for the most part, the shows weren't very successful and the artwork didn't sell very well. And he also experienced a lot of rejection. A lot of fine art galleries didn't want to show Andy Warhol's work because it was either too effeminate, too homoerotic, or they didn't want to be associated with Warhol because he was so infamous as a commercial artist. You know, a lot of galleries wanted to reinforce that divide between fine art and commercial art, and they knew Warhol's reputation as a commercial illustrator, and so they would deliberately reject him, just because they didn't want to be associated with like a sellout, right? But the Shoe in America exhibit did pretty well. The drawings did actually sell, and the opening itself was attended by celebrities like Julie Andrews and her husband, Tammy Grimes. And then remarkably, the artwork was actually featured in Life magazine in 1957. So this is Andy Warhol's first feature in Life magazine. He didn't reappear in the magazine as a feature until he became a famous pop artist in the 60s. And there's no like direct explanation for why exactly Life magazine decided to feature these shoes. Blake Gopnik, the famous Warhol historian, was kind of baffled in the footnotes of his book by how much publicity the crazy golden slippers ended up receiving. And one of Warhol's friends actually came with Warhol to Warhol's meeting at Life magazine when they were talking about possibly featuring the shoes. And apparently Andy himself was really convinced that Life magazine was going to reject them. So apparently he was saying, oh God, they're not going to like these. This is going to be absolutely terrible. They're going to tear me down. So Warhol was not expecting Life magazine to exhibit his shoes either. But lo and behold, the Crazy Golden Slipper spread did appear in 57. And so that's how the Art Directors Club was exposed to it. And they did, include Andy Warhol in their annuals for his Crazy Golden Slippers. And so at the museum, we do have some ripped pages from Life magazine showing the spread. We also, once again, have the large format color transparencies that are used for reproducing Warhol's original illustrations. So this was the shoe that Warhol did to illustrate Truman Capote, which is interesting because Warhol had a big crush on Truman Capote in the 1950s. Capote was like Warhol's celebrity crush, and Warhol would send him fan letters and love letters and call his apartment and talk to Capote's senile mother throughout the 1950s. And of course, this is before Warhol was really famous, and so Truman Capote thought that was really weird, and he thought Warhol was just this kind of strange, annoying man before they ended up becoming good friends in the 60s and 70s. But Capote and Warhol had a mutual friend, a socialite named D.D. Ryan, and she bought the original Truman Capote shoe that was shown at the Crazy Golden Slipper art exhibit, and she gave it to Truman Capote as a gift, as sort of a joke, about the fact that Warhol was such a big fan of his. We also have an unused Crazy Golden Slipper. We have this golden shoe drawing in our collection that didn't make it into the Life magazine spread, and it's named after someone named Tony. So I'm not sure if it's Tony Curtis or Tony Bennett. My guess is Tony Bennett, who was a little bit more famous than Tony Curtis at this point, because Tony Curtis didn't become super famous until the end of 1957. But anyway, Moving on from the shoes, I thought it was really interesting that the Art Directors Club highlighted this ad or this illustration that Warhol did for 17 magazine in 1958, which features a photograph taken by Ed Wallowich. So Warhol is the one that drew this like streetcar cityscape scene that you can see in the background. But Ed Wallowich is the one who took the photograph of the woman sitting in front of the illustration. And so Ed Wallowich was actually Warhol's first serious long-term relationship. Warhol had had a few boyfriends before Ed Wallowich, but this was his first, really serious long-term one. They dated for 2 years from 1956 to 1958. He was a photographer from Philadelphia, and he and Warhol were not just lovers, but also artistic collaborators. So Wallowich took a lot of really lovely, intimate photographs of Warhol during the years that they were dating. And, there are a few different photographers captured Warhol image during this period, but Ed Wallowich is the one that really kind of captured Warhol showing some emotion, and he's the one that really got the closest to Warhol and was able to kind of bring out that expressive quality in his photographs. He also did a series of photographs where he would project his other photos onto Andy Warhol's space. So that's why I thought it was interesting that, you can see in the 17 ad that the ad is projected onto a woman's face. And I think that woman could be Ed's little sister, Anna May Wallowich, but I'm not totally certain. But still, a lot of Ed's photos got used, not just in Warhol's commercial art, but in his fine art projects. So Ed had a tendency to do street photography where he would just wander around Manhattan and take portraits of complete strangers. And Andy Warhol would use Ed's photos for drawings like this one from a gold book, which was a special artist book that Warhol put out in 1957, featuring his drawings printed on a bunch of shiny metallic gold pieces of paper. And so you can see the obvious relationship between the two images. So for Warhol to do a drawing like this, he would have used his blotted line technique, which was his go-to art making method throughout the 1950s, where he would trace Ed's photo with a fountain pen, but he would only trace like a little bit at a time. So while the ink was still wet, he could blot the wet ink onto another piece of paper. And so that's how you get this delicate line made up of individual droplets of ink. And so the final result has this really lovely hand-drawn quality, but it's also a very faithful reproduction of his source material. And so Andy Warhol and Ed Wallowich, they did break up in 1958, but they continued to work together and they continued to be artistic collaborators for several more years, even when they weren't dating anymore. So they continued to work together through Andy Warhol's early pop art period. Like during the early 60s, Warhol was working on a series of drawings and paintings of American dollar bills. And so rather than just use the cash itself, he would ask Ed to take photographs for him of the dollar bills. And so Warhol used this Wallowich photograph to create this drawing that we've got in our collection. So it's a much kind of looser, sketchier rendering than that blotted line drawing, but you can still see the connection. And they continued to work together through 1962 when Warhol was embarking on his famous Campbell Soup can series. So for Warhol's most simple and kind of straightforward Campbell Soup can paintings, he didn't need Ed Wallowich photographs. He was mostly using stencils for that. But Warhol did do this other series of more obscure, what I call altered soup cans. So there are crushed soup cans. There are soup cans being opened by can openers. There are soup cans with a label peeling off. And so for those more complex soup can compositions, Warhol was using Ed Wallowich photographs like this. And so here is the crushed beef noodle soup can that Warhol painted. And once again, you can see the very, very obvious connection to the Wallowich photo. So, a lot of my focus presentations, I have to give a disclaimer that like, there won't be any soup cans in this presentation, but in this case, I was able to draw a very, very long connection from the Art Directors Club Annual to Warhol's Campbell Soup can paintings. But anyway, Warhol did have some other helpers and collaborators throughout his commercial art career in the 1950s. And one of them was Warhol's beloved mother, Julia Warhol. So Julia Warhol, she actually lived with Andy. They lived together in New York in the 1950s and 60s. And she also was an artist herself, and she loved to encourage Andy's creativity when he was a little kid. And she continued to help him with a lot of his commercial art by contributing her beautiful, unique handwriting. So she had this great handwriting with all these little loop-de-loops and curly cues, and she would often add text to the illustrations that Warhol was producing in his commercial art career. And so in this case, Warhol was hired by Prestige Records to do an album cover for a really interesting musician named Moondog. And Warhol had his mother do most of the work. So she was the one writing out the text of this poem by Stuart Preston about Moondog. And the thing is that, you know, she was always bad at writing in a perfectly straight line. You know, her handwriting would often kind of slope up to the right. And so what Warhol did is he had her write out the words of the poem in a few different takes so that, you know, she didn't really get a chance to slope as much if she was just writing in short verse. And so we've got like one of the pages of text in our collection. And so what Andy did, you know, after she had written it out a few different times, is he's the one that actually cut it out into strips and laid it out more neatly and cleanly. So, you know, they're still, you know, kind of crooked, right? But it does still fit in the square appropriately and fill the space in a pleasing way, which if she had written it in all one fell swoop, might not have worked out as well. So Warhol did a lot of album covers throughout the 1950s. This is another one for Prestige Records, but he worked with a lot of different record companies, but mostly doing jazz and classical music albums. So what's interesting about this Trombone by 3 album cover is that there are no trombone players. So, you know, Warhol did not try to do portraits of the 3 musicians. He did not draw trombones. What he did is he based this illustration off of an 8th century artwork showing an orchestra performing for King David. So Andy kind of isolated 3 musicians from that orchestra who are playing these ivory cornets rather than trombones. So cornets do not look or sound like a trombone at all, but it seems like Warhol was just trying to convey the idea of horns in this album cover. So it's very, very like kind of, you know, another example of Warhol doing kind of a conceptual, roundabout, indirect approach to commercial art rather than a very literal interpretation. In other instances, it was a much more straightforward illustration. So this is an an illustration for an album cover for a Count Basie album put out by RCA Victor. Warhol actually got the connection to RCA Victor through a friend at Carnegie Mellon University who later worked for RCA. But what's interesting about this Count Basie illustration is that it's arguably Warhol's first celebrity portrait, or at least his first painting of a celebrity. So Warhol did draw a few kind of less famous celebrities in his kind of personal side projects throughout the 1950s. But none of them were nearly as famous as Count Basie, and none of them were kind of finalized and finished. You know, so this one obviously does incorporate Warhol's bottom line as well as some watercolors, and it is based on like a promotional photograph of Count Basie put out by Columbia Records. And so it's a really, really great rendering of his likeness, and you know, it's years before Warhol was doing portraits of Marilyn Monroe and Liz Taylor and Jackie Kennedy. And so it's an interesting and kind of obscure example of Warhol's celebrity portraiture. And so once again at the museum, we do have some of the preliminary drawings that Warhol used for his album covers. We also have some unused drawings. So Warhol did do a few different sketches for a prospective Billie Holiday album cover that never actually materialized. And so we just have kind of the rough first drafts that never made it into anything. And then finally, the last big project that got featured in the Art Directors Club annuals was this book, Wild Raspberries. It's like a parody cookbook that Warhol put out with Susie Frankfurt. So Susie Frankfurt, she actually had her own connections to the advertising world. Her cousin was Norton Simon, and she used to work in the research department at the Young and Rubicam ad agency. And then she later married the advertising kingpin Steve Frankfurt, who was a promising art director at the time. But she got to know Andy Warhol through serendipity. So she would go to this cafe called Serendipity that Andy Warhol also went to, and Warhol would exhibit his artwork at the cafe a lot. And Frankfurt was so impressed by Warhol's art that she actually looked him up. She saw the art, loved it, went to find out who he was and what his phone number was, and called him up and made an official appointment with him and everything. And then they became fast friends, and they loved to just go out to lunch and go shopping together. And in 1959, they decided to work together on a parody cookbook called Wild Raspberries, which was a riff on the film Wild Strawberries by Ingmar Bergman, which was very, very successful at the time. So it's a really funny cookbook because it's made for people who don't cook. So you can maybe see at the top of this A&P surprise recipe that you're supposed to buy a 2-day-old sponge cake at the A&P. And so it's more about like presenting the food than about actually making it. And it's not something that you're supposed to take seriously. A lot of these recipes don't really sound appetizing at all, but it's still a very, very, very charming little book with Warhol's illustrations and his mother's handwriting for the recipes. So this recipe in particular, I thought was amusing because you're just supposed to like buy a bunch of different types of candy and put it out together on this plate and have it look nice. But you can maybe see at the bottom that it says to serve only with no cow ginger ale and to be served to very thin people. But the illustration from Wild Raspberries that made it into the Art Directors Club annuals was this one for a piglet with crab apples. And you can tell at the beginning of the recipe that, again, you weren't supposed to kind of make this yourself. You're supposed to contact Trader Vic's and order a 40-pound suckling pig to serve 15. Have Hanley take the Kerry Cadillac to the side entrance and receive the pig at exactly 6:45. But what's odd about the fact that this got included in the Art Directors Club annuals is that it was a really obscure book at the time. They initially only printed 34 copies. And Warhol, he did a lot of artist books throughout the 50s, but he didn't actually have them like officially, formally published. He would usually just do it himself. And he would give them away as gifts to his friends and his clients in the advertising world. So I assume that that's kind of how the ADC got a hold of it is, Warhol, he only made a few copies, but he gave one copy to someone in the Art Directors Club and they liked it, so they featured the piglet drawing. But even though it was very obscure at the time, it has in more recent years become one of Warhol's most well-known artist books because it was actually reprinted and republished after Andy Warhol's death. All right. So that kind of wraps up the Art Directors Club centric portion of the presentation, but real quick, I did want to just kind of feature a few other examples of Warhol's commercial art projects that didn't get as much play in the annuals. So he did do a lot of window displays for a variety of department stores, including Bonwit Teller. And he would use these folding screens that he hand painted as the backdrop for a lot of those window displays. So we have a bunch of the folding screens in our collection, one of which does feature Andy's mother's handwriting. So you can see her alphabet and you can see that it's signed as Andy Warhol's mother in the bottom corner. And she would often sign her artwork as Andy Warhol's mother because she was very, very proud of her son. So when she did that Moondog album cover, the Art Directors Club also listed her as Andy Warhol's mother rather than Julia Warhola. And we also have just like some installation photos of Warhol's old Bonwit Teller window displays. And so this is an ad he did for, a display he did for Replique Perfume, where you can just barely see the perfume. So he did this big kind of wooden fence that's sort of like graffitied with the illustrations of what looks like a lovesick teenager. But they cut out these little windows, and that's where you can actually see the perfume that this is supposed to advertise. And we have like the preliminary kind of design sketches that he used for some of those window displays. So this is an ad for Miss Dior perfume, where you can actually look inside the head of Christian Dior himself and see that he's got fashion on the brain. And then this is a very cluttered window display Warhol did for Fleming Joffe. So Fleming Joffe was another major client of Warhol's. They worked together from around 1957 through 1965. So Warhol was still doing some commercial art projects for them into his early pop art career. And Warhol did a lot of different ads for Fleming Joffe. They were an exotic leather company that specialized in snake skins and alligator skins and things like that. So Warhol did a lot of really playful advertisements showing all of those exotic animals, and he did a few like one-off posters that would feature actual leather samples right on the poster. But they also sold faux leather, fake leather. And so Warhol also did this fun ad campaign drawing imaginary fake animals with the slogan, "It's a real, genuine fake." He also hand painted this awning that was out in front of a Fleming Joffe boutique in St. Louis all the way back in 1960. But the store owners were savvy enough to save the awning and preserve it beautifully for many decades. And so we actually have the original awning in the museum collection. So if you ever make it here to Pittsburgh, you can probably, see the actual awning out on display. And then a few other techniques that Warhol used other than the blotted line with the fountain pens is rubber stamps. And that's important because it's sort of like an early, very rudimentary method of printmaking and another way for Warhol to achieve repetition, but allow for a little bit of variation within that repetition. And so these are rubber stamps that Warhol and his assistants would carve themselves out of rubber erasers. And Warhol continued to use rubber stamps in a few of his early pop art works in the 60s, most notably his S&H Green Stamp series. And then finally, Warhol was already kind of employing a staff of assistants in the 1950s. With his blotted line technique, it was easy to make a lot of different copies of the same image, but color it in different ways. And so what he would do is he would have these watercolor parties where he would invite all his friends out to lunch and they would eat and drink and watercolor together to help Warhol finish like a big series. And so you see, this variation of Warhol getting a lot of use out of an image by rendering it in a lot of different colors. And of course, Warhol was quite famous in, the 60s and 70s for painting the same thing over and over again, but with different colors each time. And so that was something that he had already established during his commercial art career in the 1950s, and something that not a lot of people, recognize, but it was an important part of him kind of developing, an art making technique and an art making philosophy. And I like to say, Warhol never painted anything once, and that was already true all the way back in 1956. And most importantly, Warhol's commercial art career really taught him a lot about the art world, about the commercial world, and about branding and about the power that you can get from associating yourself with a powerful and popular brand. And so this last image that you're seeing here is actually one of Andy Warhol's business cards. It's kind of most eccentric business card of the era, where you see this tattooed woman who is tattooed with a bunch of different corporate logos. And then Warhol cheekily put his name and address on her underwear. So it's a bit suggestive, a bit provocative, but also still a very beautiful and very detailed illustration. So I feel like it's very emblematic of Warhol and his approach to commercial art at the time. All right. So that concludes my presentation. I'm ready for some questions.
Thank you so much, Grace. That was incredible. So we actually did have a couple of questions come in. So also, if you have any more questions, please feel free to put them into the Q&A chat or in the regular chat. Okay, so the first one is, how much was Andy Warhol getting paid for these early ad illustrations?
Plenty. So, it is important to note, because Warhol had grown up so poor. He was the child of immigrants. He grew up during the Great Depression. So he had very little money to his name, very few personal possessions even, before he moved to New York City. But by the end of the decade, he was making about $70,000 a year, which is plenty of money now, but especially 70 years ago for someone with this creative career path, it's really an incredible degree of success. So Warhol was actually quite independently wealthy long before he became famous.
Cool, okay. So also, did Andy Warhol do a lot of his early illustrated ads in ink pen?
Yeah, so he's using fountain pens and Dr. Martin watercolor dyes for most of his commercial illustrations at the time, and then occasionally gold leaf or silver leaf if that was kind of a feasible and able to be reproduced, and then yeah, again, the rubber stamps from time to time, like I showed.
Got it. All right, so here's one. So Warhol's commercial work looks fabulous, but how did he feel about it himself? Did he see commercial illustration as a means to an end, something to pay off the bills until his fine art took off?
I think to a degree he did, because he was constantly attempting over and over again to break into the fine art world. And like I said, he was experiencing a lot of rejection. At the same time, he make money, and so the fact that this was so lucrative and eventually a very reliable source of income was certainly appealing to him. And the fact that he was actually getting some media attention and recognition in the form of the Art Directors Club Awards was certainly some positive reinforcement for this career path. And so I think when Warhol first moved to New York in 1949, I think he wanted to become famous, but I think he understood that he wouldn't become a famous fine art painter right away, right? So commercial art was, a very kind of promising gig to work on in between. And by the time he became famous, he really kind of understood that he would have to part from commercial art as soon as possible, but he still needed it, So again, that's why he was still working for Fleming Joffe 365, was because the artwork, the fine artwork wasn't paying the bills initially, but he kind of figured that it would sort of be bad for his brand if he was still seen as a commercial artist at the same time that he was becoming a fine artist. But also, on the other hand, I think that the reason that he painted the soup cans and the Coca-Cola bottles and the Brillo boxes was because he wanted to break down that barrier between fine art and commercial art. He was tired of all of these galleries rejecting him because he was a commercial artist. And so he wanted to put art that was way more commercial than his own advertising illustrations, the art of the Campbell Soup label and the Coca-Cola bottle. He wanted to put that in the art gallery to really break down that barrier once and for all.
Okay, so another one that came through the Q&A chat. How did he make a name for himself initially, besides through competitions?
Oh, well, I think it was just through being incredibly prolific to the point that just, a lot of different ad agencies were talking about him. He had a reputation for being very agreeable, a lot less headstrong than other illustrators who were reluctant to make any changes. Andy would do whatever his boss wanted, and he was known to be very over-prepared with the blotted line technique. He could make a lot of different versions of the same illustration. So he would show up, to his business meetings with way more artwork than they had asked for. And then he was also known to be rather eccentric. So they called him Raggedy Andy because he would wear like dirty, ripped up clothes. His portfolio was always a mess. Apparently at one meeting with Harper's Bazaar, a cockroach ran out of his portfolio, and then he would also just make weird, bizarre jokes in these very formal business meetings as a way to kind of stand out, and so even though it might have been viewed as a little bit unprofessional, it was memorable and it was charming and endearing. And so that's what made art directors like working with him.
So next one is why, sorry, let's see. Oh, when and why did he drop the A off the end of his name?
Yeah, so he had already been experimenting with different nicknames all the way back in high school and college. You would kind of sign his artwork in a few different ways. And then for that Glamour magazine spread, Success is a Job in New York, they had actually misprinted his name as Andy Warhol, but he kind of stuck with it. It was the first time his name had appeared in print, and he figured that it would kind of help his brand if he, kept with that and didn't confuse people. But also you have to keep in mind the influence of the Cold War and the Red Scare. Warhol, his ancestry is Carpatho-Rusin, but the Carpatho-Rusin people are from Slovakia in Eastern Europe. And so Warhol knew that, having a foreign sounding name like Warhola would lead people to ask where he was from. And if he said Czechoslovakia, that would lead to certain implications. So even though, he wasn't a communist at all, that's for sure, he did still feel the impulse to kind of adopt a more American or Anglo-Saxon sounding last name. And so this happened gradually. By the mid 1950s, it was official, and he had legally changed his name and incorporated Andy Warhol Enterprises by 1956.
Cool. So which artwork was his breakthrough from commercial art to fine art / postmodern art?
Yeah, I would say it was the soup cans. So he had done, he had started painting soup cans in like 1960 and 61, and then it was in the summer of 1962 that he had his first Campbell Soup can show, so showing those 32 different soup can paintings. And it became a national news story, not because everybody liked it, but just because the debate over whether a painting of Campbell Soup should be fine art, that debate became a national news story and helped make him a household name.
Oh. Did other artists slash advertisers start copying his style, or was he one of a kind?
That's up for debate. I've seen a few other blotted line illustrations that were definitely not by Warhol, but does seem to be someone kind of riffing off of his style. But at the same time, this was an era when advertisers were using photography more and more and more. And so the people who were hiring Warhol were deliberately going against that trend and going for something a little bit more artistic and quirky and creative, rather than just putting a photo of the product you're trying to advertise. So he was kind of going against that trend in advertising, but still, enough people liked what he did that you can see some knockoffs here and there if you look.
So next one is, in our age of being famous for being famous and ripping off slash heavily borrowing from things that had already been done, what is your generation's honest opinion of both Andy Warhol and his work quality, profound artist or professional fake?
Well, as much as I'd like to, I can't speak for my whole generation. I would say that the debate is still alive today. And that is more interesting to me, than coming to a conclusion, is that to this day, there are people that think Warhol was this avant-garde conceptual genius for embracing the commercialism of the fine art world. And there are other people that are very angry that he brought that commercialism to the forefront and embraced all of these business tactics in his art making. And I think, some of those criticisms are valid. I think that Warhol was intentionally trying to poke directly at that nerve, and he wanted to create a controversy. And so he would agree with the criticisms of his artwork as much as he agreed with the praise, because he was interested in just creating something that you could have an opinion about. And so I think it's really a good thing that there are haters of Andy Warhol to this day. I think it keeps the controversy alive.
All right, next one is, do you know which work he did for Sippy Pinellas?
Oh, not off the top of my head. Sorry.
And I think we have a couple more, just a second. If Warhol was seen as a poor man's Ben Shahn, who was also in the Art Directors Club Hall of Fame, did they ever get to meet? Was Shahn a conscious inspiration of his?
I do think he was a conscious inspiration, for sure. Warhol, I probably learned about him a little bit during his schooling at Carnegie Tech in the late 1940s. But to my knowledge, I don't believe they ever met in person. I don't think they became good friends. That's for sure. But yeah, they didn't quite travel in the same circles. Ben Shahn was like the next level, right? He was a little bit too good, for Andy back at that time.
All right. And another one that came through, how many did Andy have on his staff?
Oh, so usually just a couple of people. Nathan Gluck was sort of his go-to art assistant in the 1950s, and they started to work together around 1955, 1956, and Vincent Giallo was his assistant before that. But it was usually just one or two guys that he really had on retainer. And then a lot of his, when I talk about this coloring part, a lot of people are watercoloring together. Those weren't all paid assistants. Some of them are just friends that got kind of roped into an art project unexpectedly.
So next one is, when did he become Andy? He was Andrew in the beginning?
Oh, well, he had already gone by Andy as a child. I think just in his first few jobs, he thought that he needed to pitch himself as Andrew, to be more professional. But then he quickly realized that, having the personable, friendly, juvenile Andy nickname was kind of part of his personal brand.
So are there any other museums of Andy's besides in Pittsburgh?
In fact, there is an Andy Warhol Museum in Slovakia, in like the closest city to, it's not in Mikova, where Warhol's ancestors are from, but it's in kind of like the nearer city. I haven't been there myself. I know it's much smaller than the Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh, but there is in fact more.
Design lists / ads for his interview magazine. Do you know how he decided to get into starting the magazine?
So he claimed that he founded the magazine so that he and his staff could get press passes to all of the latest film openings. And then, it also became kind of part of his lifestyle change after being shot in 1968. He was kind of a lot more paranoid about hanging out with so many bizarre and unstable people. And so the interview magazine was a nice kind of catalyst to kind of change the atmosphere at the factory and start working with some more kind of professional and business oriented people. And so even though he didn't do most of the cover art for interview magazine, he still did have a big role there. And I don't think he designed every single layout, but he did kind of have the final say, right? So whoever was doing the layouts would show it to Warhol and he would make, changes if necessary. And then it also became, even though the magazine didn't really turn a profit for the first few years, it was kind of a more reliable source of revenue than some of his paintings and especially his films.
Okay, so I think that we have one more question. So what other artists did Andy admire besides Ben Shahn and Truman Capote?
Well, in a lot of interviews, he said that his favorite artist was Walt Disney. And so I think that's, not just because he liked the movies, but he admired the way that Disney had cultivated such a powerful, dominant brand in American pop culture. But he also he collected a lot of Dada and Surrealist artworks. He collected a lot of Native American tapestries. And I would say in the fine art world, Marcel Duchamp was Warhol's main inspiration and influence. But he was really, kind of well-read and well-versed in a lot of art history. And he also said that James Rosenquist, the Billboard painter turned pop artist, was the best pop art painter.
Cool. Wow. So thank you so much, Grace. This has been incredible. So before we go, I just wanted to acknowledge the One Club for Creativity, who make the ADC Annual Awards possible. So the One Club is a nonprofit organization that supports the creative community, and the ADC 100th Annual Awards and the One Show are both currently open for entries with a deadline on March 12th. And also the Type Directors Club, who we are so excited to have recently merged with, is also open for entries with a deadline on February 5th. So be sure to check out the One Club at www.oneclub.org. And also be sure to check out our wonderful partner on this event, the Andy Warhol Museum. It's over at www.warhol.org. And so a huge thank you, Grace. That was fantastic. It was wonderful having you. And a huge thank you to everyone for taking the time in joining us this afternoon. So to everybody, stay safe and have a wonderful weekend.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for having me.